Stretch. I hope lunch woke you all up.
I trust it sent you to sleep.
So we've got Elaine Davison here. Elaine is from Curtin University and she sits on the DWG BRM subcommittee. And today she's here talking to us about BRM and frequently asked questions about those and the subcommittee. So please welcome Elaine.
Thank you very much
There we are.
indeed. Oh,
You can backwards and forwards to that one if you
okay,
like,
right.
or you can use the arrows. I don't mind.
Let's find something that works. Well, firstly, members of this subcommittee, which is part of the DIBAC working group, are from the BRM industry, the basic raw materials industry, government departments, WALGA and universities. We don't have a set number of people on that subcommittee. We don't really have any responsibilities. We're not definitely there. We're not appointed to it. We're there because we want to be there on that subcommittee. And it's a very useful forum for discussing various things. So why basic raw materials? Firstly, what are they? They're very important. They include things like gravel, sand, clay, limestone, lime sand, hard rock, and they're used in their unprocessed or minimally processed state. They're used in very large volumes and they're very important for things like road construction and repair and fill and in the building industry. They're cheap and the main cost of them is for cartage. And so they are sourced as close as possible to where they're required. Am I better positioned? Yeah. I'm sorry about that. Do you want me to go through it again? No. No. Okay. Now, there are significant risks of using BRM, significant risks of spreading Phytophthora if it's sourced from infested pits. And this is something which has been known about for more than 50 years. Consequently, many contracts for the supply of BRM specify that it's dieback free. However, it's a limited supply, and so it's a valuable resource. And how can dieback free gravel and other BRM be sourced? And how do you know it's dieback free? Now, it helps to have a definition, and DBCA have put out this definition, which really relates to the DBCA estate, Department of Biodiversity Conservation and Attractions. We've been talking in acronyms all the time. I'll try and remember not to. The definition states that it has been sourced from an area of native vegetation that has been assessed as uninfested by a registered Phytophthora dieback interpreter, and that the pit has been managed and monitored to maintain its uninfested status according to an ongoing pit dieback management plan. Well, that sounds very straightforward. So in other words, you have to find an area of uninfested native vegetation over a BRM resource, a basic raw materials resource, clear that vegetation to access the resource, and then hygienically extract it. However, uninfested native vegetation is valuable in its own right. And so it's a toss-up between the value of the vegetation and the value of the resource beneath it. So apologies to dieback interpreters for this next slide. The assessment is based on symptoms in native vegetation on the DBCA estate and other native vegetation. And a very simplistic way of looking at this is that the dieback interpreters look at an area and look for deaths in a group of indicator species. If those deaths are present, the area is considered infested or dieback. If those deaths are not present in those indicator species, the area is considered uninfested or dieback free. And there is often a grey area in between the two, areas which are uninterpretable because there is no indicator species present, or otherwise because that area may have been recently burnt and any deaths may be the result of fire damage. What about other areas? So if the assessment, oh, I forgot to mention something very important. Isolation of Phytophthora is undertaken from plant material or from soil, but it's always been seen as expensive and not always reliable. If we go to other areas and supply of BRM from these other areas, but if this assessment is based on native vegetation, then when you go to agricultural sites or plantations, they can't be assessed. So we've got a Pinus radiata plantation at the bottom, and all those deaths have got nothing to do with Phytophthora. But we know that Pinus radiata is a host of Phytophthora. So you can't say whether or not that site is infested or whether it's dieback free. And if we look at the wheat field on the other part of the slide, we know from glasshouse experiments that wheat can be infected by Phytophthora cinnamomi. However, it's not an agricultural disease of wheat. And we don't know anything about capeweed or the other weeds along the side, at least I don't, maybe somebody has tested those. So we can't say from the vegetation symptoms whether or not those sites are infested. So it's a major problem if you're trying to source dieback-free gravel or other things. We could try the COVID-19 approach, where we're using the symptoms as a guide, but the presence of the pathogen needs to be confirmed by a diagnostic test. And so why can't we rely on sampling rather than vegetation symptoms to designate a site as infested or uninfested? Well, this has been tried using sampling from old dieback sites and looking at the recovery rate of Phytophthora from soil, soil and fine roots from those old dieback sites. And this has shown that the recovery from soil is very low. It's between 0.4 and 2.5%. There have been a number of times that this has been done using large data sets, and the last one was done published 15 years ago. If you use these figures, you have to take about 500 samples, and if they're all negative, so you can't find Phytophthora in any of those, then you could say that that site was dieback free at a certain level of probability. But when you consider that each sample costs, I don't know how many dollars it does at the moment, it really becomes very expensive. And when you look at a stockpile of basic raw materials, such as these gravel stockpiles, it's the ultimate uninterpretable site. So we've got a problem. Next part of the DBCA definition is that the pit has been managed and monitored to maintain its uninfested status according to an ongoing pit dieback management plan. How can this be done? Well, DBCA would have their own processes and protocols to describe how this is done. But one thing within this BRM subcommittee, we are preparing, we hope, some best practice guidelines for the management of Phytophthora dieback in the basic raw materials industry to describe how the pits can be managed from exploration through to extraction, through to transport, and finally to pit closure. It's something which we think could be quite useful for the BRM industry. These aren't going to be prescriptive, they're guidelines only. We have no authority to say you must do this or must not do that. Another part of all of this is the demand for dieback-free BRM. Is it always needed? For example, if you were going to build a car park and it specified that the material for that car park, gravel presumably, must be dieback-free, that would be most appropriate if that car park is going to be within or adjacent to native vegetation with high conservation significance. However, if that car park is in a built-up area and it's going to be covered with tarmac, you don't need dieback-free gravel there. So looking at where it's being used and using it as a very valuable resource in areas of greatest priority. Now, some of the things that we have done, rather than just talk, is produce an interim statement on dieback-free basic raw materials, and there is a copy of this on all the tables. So if you want to see how we have defined the dieback-free basic raw materials, that's there. And we've also provided some frequently asked questions about dieback-free basic raw materials, and that too is on the tables. So, for example, what is certified dieback-free BRM? That's something that is a common question to people like EMA and probably to people at Murdoch. And the answer is that there's actually no system in the BRM industry which enforces the standards to ensure that BRM is dieback-free. So there's nothing that could be called certified dieback-free BRM. Sampling is often done from BRM stockpiles to see whether Phytophthora can be isolated. And one thing that we have got agreement on is that companies that do the sampling state on their reports that this result relates solely to the sample as supplied. Another question that's frequently asked is, can't I get someone to assess my quarry for dieback? Well, of course you can, but it's uninterpretable because of the lack of vegetation. So you're back where you started. Is there a list of suppliers of dieback-free BRM? No, there isn't. But it is a supplier is likely to be providing dieback-free BRM if the site was originally assessed as dieback-free and the site has been has a rigorous dieback management plan which is enforced for hygienic extraction and transport. So we're trying to just provide some information for the general public along the lines of the many questions that are often asked about dieback-free materials. So just to summarise this, I've opened a can of worms. That's been very evident for a long time. We're using the application of symptoms-based approach for assessing presence or absence of Phytophthora in native vegetation, but it's a system that really doesn't work in areas with no native vegetation. And there's always the direct sampling. Well, why can't I sample this area? But it appears that Phytophthora, all species, not just Phytophthora cinnamomi, may be widespread, but they can be very infrequent. This leads to a lot of uninterpretable sites and uninterpretable stockpiles. And we think we need some guidelines for the exploration, extraction, transport, rehabilitation, and pit closure for the BRM industry. So we're trying to do that. We're going very slowly. And on the dieback working group website, we've put out this interim statement on dieback-free basic raw materials and the frequently asked questions about dieback-free BRM. Thank you very much.
We'll take questions now at the end of each presentation. We're back on track and I just think it is going to work better. So any questions for Elaine? Yes, Jeremy?
Elaine, the question that Andy wanted to raise. Elaine, where are we at with, I think it was some work done by Michael Bryan, about a few years ago, they did some work on removal of organic material from gravel stockpiles and then testing to that level with a 99% confidence level, and found that they couldn't recover Phytophthora after 2 years. Has that been, screened, remove organic material? Is that being used as a process?
I think you need to talk to the people from Murdoch about that because I haven't been involved in anything like that.
And to your knowledge, it's not become practice in the industry?
Well, there's certainly nothing that I think is being done in the industry at the moment in that score. So I think you need to talk to other people. Okay. Can I go now?
I'll just get you to speak into the microwave.
You mentioned samples that were taken in that research. What area is that over?
It's a very good question, Ian. This study of which ended up with the 500 samples, it was looking at grids of 100 samples over a number of different areas and then using that to estimate the number of samples that would be needed. It's not per unit area, and I think that's something which is not always understood. It's on over a site which is seen as a uniform site. So that uniform site could be 10 hectares, it could be 100 hectares. So it's not area specific, it's uniform site specific. Okay.
Anyone from?
Good.
No?
Now, Jeremy, isn't it? Yeah, okay, Jeremy, sit down and wait for the and wait for the next presentation.